Hi YouTube, it's another day of VEDA vlog or video every day in April. So today I came across memories on Facebook, a paper I wrote in college. I haven't read it in years, but I remember really enjoying writing it. I remember being very into this paper, and according to my little note I have on here, I got an A. So I thought it'd be just kind of fun to read it and then maybe say a couple of my thoughts quite a few years removed from writing the paper. Let's see, so I'm going to be reading from my laptop here because it showed up in my Facebook memories, and I won't be looking directly at camera. Cultural relevance for the church. And I'm going to apologize. I don't have 100% voice right now. Acts 17:22 through 34. People love to fight about the value of the way things are done. Some individuals are so stuck on having things go exactly a certain way that they can never adjust to circumstances. However, without any sort of change, things are doomed to fail. The Apostle Paul, as shown in Luke's Acts, strays from the newly formed conventions of evangelism and shows the value of understanding the culture one is ministering to. Background. By the time of Paul, Athens has seen better days. It was once the capital of a great empire, but despite being conquered, it still had value. Rome let it stay relatively free and allowed for its institutions to continue to function. Athens was also still one of the major hubs for intellectual activity. This worked nicely because Athens had every sort of temple one would imagine and want. One would want and thought tended to revolve around the latest religious fad. Although the people of Athens liked to discuss religion, there were definite things and groups that they stuck to. Epicureans were one of these groups. They rejected piety and tradition because they saw the gods as all but absent from the world. On the flip side, the Stoics believed in providence and the gods' involvement. On the other, one other important point of religion to the Athenians was death. Some people thought of it as a sad abode of the dead, known as Hades, and the Epicureans simply thought that there was nothing after death. The Stoics had a slightly happier outlook for after death, but even they only thought of a limited immortality for the soul. It is this world that Paul walks into. Before his journey to Athens, Paul has been proclaiming the gospel in Berea, but a crowd wanted to attack him. So his fellow Christians sent him to Athens. And it is when he is laying low, waiting for his friends to join him, he noticed the idolatry of the people. It is the distress of their false worship that leads Paul to begin speaking the truth of Christ. However, instead of just interesting the Jews of the community, Paul's words make the Stoics and Epicurean philosophers curious too. After Paul had interested the philosophers of Athens, they decided to take him the Areopagus. In ancient times, the Areopagus served as the high court for Athens, which led some to assume that Paul may have been on trial. However, being that there is no known accusation, it seems pretty clear that it was probably not a legal trial. This is because the Areopagus also served as a favorite meeting place for philosophical discussion, and it is where Paul expanded on the Christian philosophy for the great minds of Athens. Paul begins his speech by telling the Athenians that he noted how very religious they are. The basic meaning of the term is that one has fear or is pious in their attitude towards the gods. But this sometimes held negative feel of superstition. The idea of criticism in this passage has been passed down in the church tradition, notably in the King James Version's interpretation of the term. This concept can be cooperated by the fact that many Jews of Paul's time did talk about how pious Athenians were in negative fashion. It's also important to note that it was a huge insult. Calling someone the negative form was worse than calling them an atheist in a highly religious society. Since the negative is such an insult, it is probably not a likely candidate for the beginning of evangelistic speech. In fact, it was customary in a speech to praise one's audience. This term is not normally used as a negative description. An example of this can be seen later on in Acts, when Festus seems to just be describing the faith of Judaism. However, perhaps Paul was smart to use a term that was a bit ambiguous, and it might have been even to his benefit. The Epicureans could have seen this as siding with them since they rejected religion, while the Stoics could have seen it as a compliment since they were genuinely religious. Paul then moves his speech by putting hooks into their way of thinking. He talks about how he saw objects of their religion while in the shadow of the Parthenon, probably their greatest example, and then turns to view it critically. This is where Paul introduces the unknown God to his argument. Worshipping an unknown deity brought a feeling of safety to people, no wrath due to ignorance, and it does appear in ancient writings. Ritual for Greeks had to be precise, and this even went with worship to the unknown. 6 centuries before, a plague was ravaging them, and a prophet used animals to divine where precisely they should place their altars to unknown gods. The legacy from this preach can be found in the historically known altars to unknown gods. However, there has never been one found to a singular unknown deity. Some scholars have suggested that this singular altar might have just missed the eye of those who wrote about them, or even that it was dedicated to the God of Israel, whose name was not uttered, but the latter is unlikely. Some do not like Paul using what is most likely a pagan temple to open up discussion about God. However, he is focusing on the ignorance, not worship. So he's not saying that God is taking the sacrifice. In fact, by talking about an unknown God, Paul's actually gently explaining monotheism. He also recognizes a conscious need appeasing the unknown gods. But instead of introducing a new God, he unveils one that's been there all along. Using something they are aware of distracts from discomfort of new gods, and in all actuality, early Christians often said God was around the pagans unconsciously. There are many people that complain that Paul's speech does not have enough doctrine to it, but that is simply not true, as seen in Paul's next point. God is creator. Paul only used other faiths as a means of general revelation. He showed God as the supreme ruler over what he had made. The temples and sacrifices are insignificant, since he has shown humanity has no power over God. We see the continuing theme Luke has, that men cannot serve God with things. Greeks would have been used to the idea that a Jew critiquing them on idolatry, but Paul was going beyond this. Paul's speech goes completely against the deities and temples, and the Jews believe that. So this statement that utterly shakes the status quo, because sacrifice in the temple was the main understanding of worship to the culture, especially the Stoics. However, the irony is that the Stoics founder believed Paul's view, although Epicureans would have agreed with Paul because they saw God as self-sufficient and too far off to care about sacrifices. It is once Paul has the ear of the Epicureans that he twists back around to say that humanity's creation was a direct act. This explains why the sacrifices are fruitless. God gives humanity everything, even life. And so we have nothing to give that is not already his. Yet this is another moment of genius. Paul now, because now the Stoics who believe life came from the divine have turned back to what he has to say. So this is longer than I remember. But I do remember, man, looking at this, why I liked it so much. Paul is such an interesting guy, and he is taking what people in this area have, and he's morphing it towards a way to help them understand and to kind of put things on their head. And I remember reading this, writing this, and being very into just the focus on the unknown God, and taking what's culturally significant here. But going back and reading about the different philosophies and stuff present, there are points that I've kind of forgot about over the last, I think I wrote this 16 years ago, which is crazy. But I know I'm just about to get into the meat of the part that made me very excited. And I know that the part coming up is the part that I still will bring up sometimes when I have conversations with people, and how it stuck with me. And I miss some aspects of going to Bible college so much, because nothing technically stops me from doing research and spending time and digging into a passage, but the time that one has, the ability to do certain things, and the resources currently available to me are not the same as when I was in college. I have some commentaries, I have some that, but I don't have Kittle. Ami, I don't have the detailed stuff that I had in that library, and I miss having access to some of that stuff. And man, it was so cool to do that and to write this 16 years ago and to dig into things. So, like I said, I know the part I really loved is coming up. So I think I'm going to split this into at least 2 videos and continue reading this tomorrow and get to talk a little more in detail about how I hit that point that I was very interested in 16 years ago, and how I look at it now as a person in her late 30s. So I will see you guys tomorrow for more VEDA. Bye.